Before we begin, I kindly ask you to spare a minute of silence for the victims of the genocide in Gaza, Palestine. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. In August 2023, sad news reached the Philippines about a Filipino seaman named Wenceslao Esguerra Donasco, who died in Scotland after securing the gangway of the ship he worked on from its second deck and hitting the pier side. The death was ruled as an accident, and the news cycle soon continued as Donasco's family was left to grapple with the aftermath of his death. Whilst this case was clearly about an accident, a few netizens were reminded of a ship-related case from 1995 that to this day still remains unsolved. Unlike Donasco's case, this almost 30-year-old case's effects continue to ripple through the lives of those left behind by the person who died back in 1995. The case is yet another perfect poster child of how ineffective, corrupt, and deeply flawed our justice system is. This case also showed how difficult it can be to go against an entity such as the Philippine Navy, who seem to devotedly protect their own, until you dance out of line, of course, allegedly. This case became a convoluted mess through the years and still is one, leaving us with the question, will we ever uncover the truth about this case in our lifetime? This is the case of Navy Ensign Felipe Andrew Pestaño. Mabuhay LagimFam, as I announced on Instagram, this is going to be the last episode of Season 4, but the season opener for Season 5 will be available tomorrow. I am so sorry for the unplanned hiatus. Apart from trying to bear witness and spread to you and others what is going on in Palestine, my personal life is also going through the motions. It has been hard to come back, but I love this passion project too much, and I love you, my listeners, LagimFam, too much to let this go. Another thing, you may also have noticed that the episode about the Philippine High School for the Arts is gone. I have temporarily taken it down for reasons I will keep private for now. I will have to rewrite the script and re-record some bits in the future. Once I get some breathing space in the midst of applying for new jobs and getting the podcast up and running again, I will upload the revised episode. I hope you can understand. Now, without further ado, let us get into today's episode. As always, details in this episode might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. On the 20th of September 1995, the BRP Bacolod City, a Philippine Navy cargo ship, made its way from Tawi-Tawi through different ports in the country, with a goal to ultimately dock at the Navy headquarters in Manila. On board were several Navy personnel, including a 23-year-old native of Cebu, Navy Ensign Felipe Andrew Pestaño, a cargo officer. It was his request to his father, Felipe, that he be picked up in Manila upon arrival. There was only one problem. Philip never made it to Manila alive. Somewhere between the ship's last stopover at Sangli Point in Cavite and Manila, Philip died. The cause of death was clear from the get-go, a single gunshot wound to the right temple, but the manner of death would become subject of many debates, court cases, investigations, and one of the most prominent true crime mysteries in the Philippines. So, what happened? According to initial reports from the Navy personnel aboard the BRP Bacolod, Philip had died by suicide and had even left a suicide note in his cabin. The pistol that Philip supposedly used to harm himself was also lying beside him. There were talks even then about how this all made sense since Philip had mental health difficulties before. He had problems with his parents who did not approve of his choice of girlfriend and soon-to-be wife. There had also been reports about at least one previous attempt of self-harm when Philip had supposedly slashed his wrists, prompting a visit to the hospital. Then there were the reports that Philip had allegedly abused illegal drugs, and maybe that drove him to kill himself. Hogwash, his parents would say. Right from the start, the Pestaño family was adamant that their son and brother did not die by suicide. This was cold-blooded murder. But why would they say that? Both Felipe and Evelyn Pestaño argued that their son had no reason to hurt himself. They said their son was looking forward to getting married and had generally a lot to live for. I've tried to find any statement the parents may have made in response to comments about how they did not like their son's fiancée but could not find any. I suppose we cannot assume one way or another, so I am willing to just park that bit for now. In any case, Felipe and Evelyn were not willing to just accept that their son had died by suicide, especially because whilst he was still alive and traveling on board the BRP Bacolod, Philip had a phone conversation with his father. According to Felipe Pestaño, Philip told him about the transport of illegal drugs, logs, and even illegal firearms. It would seem, at least from Felipe's point of view, Philip was far away from being suicidal but more concerned about the disturbing discovery he made on his ship. With this in mind, Felipe and Evelyn did not know that they would be embarking on a long fight to be heard and seen by the powers that be, the powers that could provide clarity on what happened to their son. Please note that articles on the Pestaño case that are from the 90s are very hard to come by online. By using Google News Archives, I was able to find a couple of articles or news clippings by the Manila Bulletin, as it is the only archived Filipino newspaper that dates back to the mid-80s and onwards. From this archive research, I learned that by November 1995, the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, had already gotten involved with the Pestaño investigation. I presume they were invited by the Philippine Navy to investigate the matter, as they may have been perceived as better equipped, being the police force that they are. Remember, however, that the Navy itself had already ruled Philip's death as suicide, and the NBI later agreed. Under then NBI Director Mariano Mison, the NBI concluded that Philip had taken his own life because he felt a lot of pressure and could not handle life anymore. The NBI checked the authenticity of the suicide letter and concluded that Philip had written it. I am not sure how they did that, since handwriting analysis even now still divides opinions on it, being either a science or more like a guessing game. Either way, the letter was a huge issue, as Philip's parents insisted that their son did not write it. For the longest time, this NBI investigation would be the only huge investigation that was done on the case. Following the NBI's conclusion, Philip's parents refused to accept it and fought for 2 years to escalate the matter, either through the courts or through other avenues. They succeeded at last in 1997 and 1998, when both the PNP Criminal Investigation and Detection Group, or PNP CIDG, and the Philippine Senate decided to get involved. In 1997, the Philippine Navy continued to hold on to their statement that Philip had died by suicide. That year, the PNP-CIDG started their own investigation. I could only find a couple of archived articles from 1997, so I tried to make sense of these articles when I was doing my research. I'm not sure when the PNP investigation started, but an article from June 1997 contained information that seemed to be part of what the PNP found out in their investigation. On board the BRP Bacolod, there was at least one other officer who came forward to say that Philip had indeed taken his own life. Alvin Parone, who said he was a friend of Philip's, would later tell another Navy officer who he met in Cavite that Philip admitted how he had planned on taking his own life. This other officer was Roberto Baranda, and from what I understood, it was Baranda who was later interviewed by the PNP during their investigation. Around the time of the PNP investigation, as I understood it, there were also reports swirling around about how Philip's family received an insurance payout, and that payout was only possible because Philip was believed to have been killed. The claim was that the insurance money would not have been paid out if the insurance company was certain that Philip died by suicide. The Philippine Navy disputed this, saying that the circumstances around the death did not matter to the insurance policy. The insurance monies were just paid in the event of any kind of death. I find that hard to believe, but I also could not find anything from that time to further explain what really went on with this insurance claim. More interesting, however, were some of the other revelations that came out around this time in 1997. Reports have surfaced that on board the BRP Bacolod was a shipment of lumber or logs, drugs, specifically around 50 sacks of shabu, and weapons that were never supposed to be on that ship. The lumber shipment was apparently a gift from the governor of Tawi-Tawi to then Admiral Pio Carranza. And whilst that seemed such a thoughtful thing to do by the governor, Navy ships are not supposed to be used to transport things as a personal favor for any Navy officer, regardless of rank. Now, even back in 1995, the rumor was that Philip got wind of the lumber shipment being loaded onto the BRP Bacolod. He allegedly refused to authorize the loading, but his objections were overridden. The lumber was supposedly offloaded in Cavite, which caused some delay in the ship's schedule. The suspicion was that this delay was not only attributable to the offloading of the illegal lumber in Cavite, but was also because something must have transpired that involved Philip, which eventually led to his death and the creation of the suicide scenario, if we were to ask his parents' opinion. All of this and other details would soon be laid bare during a Senate probe that started in mid-1997. So, what did we learn from the Senate probe? I think the most egregious thing amongst so many other egregious things that I learned from the little information I could find about the 1997 to 1998 Senate probe was that immediately after Philip was found dead, despite the lingering doubts about the cause of his death, no one thought or no one made sure that his body was examined. Yes, there was never an autopsy back then. Furthermore, the Senate had heard testimonies of numerous witnesses who more or less said the same thing. Philip did not kill himself. Instead, he was allegedly bludgeoned to death in another part of the ship where he was then subsequently shot as well. He was then carried to his cabin where the suicide scene was essentially staged, meaning he was laid on his bed and then the suicide note, which was composed by supposedly two people, was then placed beside him, and the same was done to the supposed weapon he used to kill himself. Excerpts from the Senate report that I have found would also show that their investigation yielded some interesting results that would easily let you believe that the scene was staged and that a murder was a more likely scenario than not. The report shows that there was a clear absence of blood spatters, bone fragments, and other human tissues, something that can be found at a suicide scene involving a gun. As the report remarked, quote, "It is impossible for a person who has just sustained a fatal head injury to walk from some other place in his room, lie on his bed, and drop dead." End of quote. The Senate believed that Philip was killed by someone, but not just one person. The scene was so staged, and deliberately so. The Senate believed there were several people involved. And then there was the video. There was a video recording made by another Navy officer immediately after the crew of BRP Bacolod had supposedly found Philip dead in his cabin. In the video, the Navy officer first focuses on the suicide note, pans to Philip's lifeless body, and then to some blood on the floor. But these were not the most interesting findings that the investigators for the Senate made. In the video, a lifeless Philip could be seen wearing an analog wristwatch. The first time the senators saw this, the timestamp said 8:58 a.m. Already this was a problem since the cameraman, an officer named Miguel Baroy, stated that he commenced recording at 8:30 a.m. That is a pretty large discrepancy. In the reports about the video, we are then told that the next timestamps on the video are at 9 and 9:08 a.m., which again was cause for concern because Baroy said he remembered only filming for 3 minutes. This then begged the question, was Baroy really the one filming, or was he some ill-coached patsy being fed to the Senate without any prep at all? The Senate went into a short recess after this, and when everyone was back, some senators asked Baroy some repeat questions, and suddenly Baroy said he could not remember when he filmed the video and for how long. There was also the matter of the bullet holes in one of Philip's cabin walls. The video apparently showed a bullet hole or two, but Philip's parents have always insisted that they could provide witnesses who could swear that there were never any bullet holes in Philip's cabin originally, essentially implying that the holes were made or shot after Philip had already died or was killed. Lastly, there was also an issue with something that the Senate's video technicians noticed. After they saw the 9:08 a.m. timestamp on Philip's wristwatch, the video cuts out, goes blank, and then resumes. This was taken as possible or plausible evidence that the video may have been tampered with. The Navy denied this, of course. They went into defense mode and challenged Philip's family to allow an exhumation of their son's body so that the Navy could prove that Philip had gunpowder traces on his body, clear evidence, according to them, that he had died by suicide. Now, we are putting a pin on this because this bit will get a bit more interesting a couple years later when we get to learn a bit more about Philip's body and what had happened to it in the immediate aftermath of his supposed suicide or murder. Needless to say, the Senate concluded that Philip was murdered. They directed then Ombudsman Aniano Desierto to identify the individuals involved in the murder of Ensign Pestaño. Weirdly enough, these directions were completely ignored by Desierto. There was an investigation done by the Office of the Ombudsman, but the goal of that investigation was not to identify any potential suspects in Philip's death. Not at all. Instead, Desierto seemed to have just wanted to investigate the case to tick a box before declaring the case closed in 2000, and basing his decision on a 1998 report by the Office of the Deputy Ombudsman for the military. Let me explain a bit further because things can get murky a bit at this point. My understanding was that the directions given to Desierto in 1997 were different from whatever or whoever ordered the investigation done by this ombudsman for the military, henceforth to be called OM in this podcast episode so that we don't get confused. Investigator Roy Roque Dador of the OM, so Ombudsman of the Military, remember, concluded that despite this case being a likely murder, there was no real point in further investigating and going after any potential suspects because it would all be a waste of time. This was a bold thing to say, especially because of what Dador uncovered in his own investigation. Dador stated that the reason he thought Philip was likely murdered was because of how his cabin room was handled. The suspicions about how Philip's room was potentially staged were well-founded, according to him. Dador learned that an Ensign Joselito Calico mishandled the gun that was shown in the video. He supposedly picked up the gun with a cloth, carried it outside the cabin, and then placed it back where he picked it up from. This was a red flag because this Ensign Calico had no business picking up anything from a potential crime scene. Again, this type of behavior pointed to not only a potentially staged suicide scene, but also a contamination of a potential crime scene altogether. Now, just to bring this part of the story to full circle, other investigations would show later that the gun that was eventually found beside Philip was not even the gun that killed him, adding yet again another layer of mystery to this case. Now, going back to Dador's findings, he also stated that an Ensign Edwin Vigilar ended up literally cleaning Philip's body and face with warm water and then specifically aiming a water hose at the gunshot wound. How was this not enough to push the investigation in the direction of a potential prosecution in 1998? I do not think we will ever know. In the end, this report was heavily relied on by Ombudsman Desierto when he finally declared the case closed in 2000, causing even more heartache for the Pestaños who believed that they were up against some powerful entities hell-bent on whitewashing what happened to their son. The ombudsman that succeeded Desierto, Merceditas Gutierrez, was not any better and refused time and time again to even see the Pestaños personally. Philip's family had beforehand filed a complaint against the Navy officials they deemed involved in their son's death, but Gutierrez simply dismissed this complaint later in 2009, saying that the evidence was at best circumstantial. I will shortly allude to this point in the timeline later on because I'm getting ahead of myself. Needless to say, the Pestaños never wavered in their belief that their son did not take his own life. They would continue on pushing until another Senate hearing was initiated towards the end of 2001. Now, just to quickly remark here, and in case you're super confused, Ombudsman Desierto obviously behaved weirdly at best and negligently at worst for dismissing the case despite a somewhat firm belief that Philip was murdered. It did not make any sense for him to decide this way. It was like saying one thing but doing the complete opposite. I wish I was able to find more about this weird turn of events during Desierto's time as ombudsman, but this is yet another mystery within this already mysterious case. An archived news article by the Philippine Daily Inquirer dated 8th of October 2001 reported that an Army intelligence chief by the name of Colonel Victor Corpus was asked during a 2001 Senate hearing to shed some light on the Pestaño case. Corpus did not hesitate to confirm that there was a link between Philip's death and the rumored shipment of shabu on the BRP Bacolod. Philip's family, whose sheer determination was one of the factors that led to this Senate hearing, wanted Corpus to specifically comment on a leaked intelligence report, which allegedly, amongst other things, contained this issue with the drug shipment. They wanted him to elaborate even further on other parts of this report. As I understand it, this leaked report also contained bombshell information about who the hitman was in Philip's case. According to the Pestaño family and their seemingly familiar knowledge of the contents of this report, the hitman was a personal aide of a high-ranking Navy ship officer. Now, what is confusing about only getting bits and pieces from the internet's archive is that a lot of the time, context and connecting information are missing. In this article about the leaked report and the new Senate hearing, there is mention about the Senate hearing also being about the criminal activities of Panfilo Lacson, the same Lacson that is still holding public office to this very day. He does not get mentioned again in connection to Philip's case, but what I want to impress upon you is that it would seem that Philip's family was up against some very powerful entities here, not only within the Navy, but also Philippine politics in general. I also want to comment at this point that it would have been great if I could have found even portions or excerpts of this leaked intelligence report, but alas, I could not. As I have already said over and over again, Philip's death was swiftly dismissed as a suicide case by government entities such as the Navy, the NBI, and even the PNP. Now, the Senate at the 2001 Senate hearing disagreed, as they already did back in the late 90s. Philip's death, according to them, was the result of foul play. However, whilst you might think this is a good thing, the family did not. They told the media back then that despite this little hope of being finally believed and heard, the family felt like they were still not being supported, meaning no proper investigation was being conducted despite how the Senate felt. They even felt as a family as if they were expected to conduct their own investigation privately and then just somehow present their findings to the police afterwards. The Senate itself said that any publicly funded investigation into Philip's death was a waste of time, just like what Desierto said a few years before. It would seem that the Pestaño family could not catch a break, and another blow was just waiting in the wings in the form of known forensic pathologist Dr. Raquel Fortun, who concluded that Philip died of suicide. I found an article that referred to a Senate questioning of Dr. Fortun, and I am assuming that the Senate questioning took place during the 2001 hearing, meaning that Dr. Fortun was talking about her autopsy of Philip's body that could have taken in and around 2001, or at the very least, much later than September 1995. I have so many questions, obviously, because remember I told you earlier that no autopsy was conducted when Philip's body was finally brought back to shore. So when did Dr. Fortun get involved, bearing in mind that at some point, Philip's body was given back to his family so that he could be buried? Was Dr. Fortun conducting the autopsy as a private matter, commissioned by the family, or was she working for the NBI or PNP when this autopsy happened? Could we justifiably question the accuracy of such an autopsy knowing that it was not done immediately after Philip's body was removed from the ship? Sadly, these questions will remain unanswered, as I could not find any other archived news article that could help us get a clearer picture of how things unfolded back in 2001. Needless to say, however, this finding by Dr. Fortun was taken very seriously. Obviously, it was a confirmation for the Navy, the PNP, and the NBI that Philip had indeed died by suicide. We now jump 4 years ahead and into 2005 when former NBI director turned Senator Alfredo Lim, in what I presumed was yet another Senate hearing, raised concerns over what he thought were inconclusive findings on the suicide note Philip Pestaño had allegedly written. Senator Lim's focus was on expert Nelly Sora. She was the one who apparently analyzed Philip's handwriting on this suicide note. Now, for me, this was a bit of a comical move on Lim's part, since when he was the NBI director, his bureau confidently found that the note was written by Philip, leading to its conclusion that the young ensign died by suicide. So essentially, he was the one who hired Nelly Sora to analyze the suicide note. Now, a month after Senator Lim raised this question about the suicide note, he brought up another point, and I'm not sure if he was trying to actively and vehemently distance himself from the NBI's conclusion on the matter of Philip's death, which seems odd to me since Lim was the NBI, given that he was the director back then. Indirectly or directly throwing his old workplace under the bus seems counterintuitive. However, as I said, a month after Senator Lim raised the question about the handwriting, he then asked a couple more questions, specifically about those 2 bullet holes on the wall where Philip had supposedly killed himself. Now, this question becomes even more interesting when you remember that Philip sustained a gunshot wound to his temple, a shot that was later determined to be from a downward trajectory. As Senator Lim would also question later on, if you were shooting yourself, the trajectory would be anything but downwards. Anyone who has seen an episode of any crime show would know that a downward bullet trajectory almost always hints at an execution-style killing, and I suppose This is what Lim was playing at during this new iteration of the Senate hearing into Philip's case. Lim also added some other questions that would reveal to us some bits of information we did not get to learn about the case yet. Why did Philip not have any gunpowder residue on his fingers? Remember when Philip's family was challenged and asked to permit an exhumation of Philip's body to prove he had gunpowder residue? Well, it would seem that between that moment and 2001, it was proven that Philip never had any gunpowder residue, strengthening the evidence that supports a murder case over a suicide one. Lim asked further, why was the gun found on the scene not actually the gun used to inflict the gunshot wound that Philip sustained? Again, this is new information since we only really knew about how badly the Navy personnel on BRP Bacolod handled the gun that was found near Philip. It would seem that new information obtained by Senator Lim showed that there may have been tampering of the supposed crime weapon as well. But as you know, I've already alluded to this earlier. Senator Lim asked further questions in relation to information that he found out in his investigation. He asked, why did 2 Navy personnel mysteriously disappear after September 2005? One of them was a radio operator who supposedly received the report about Shabu being aboard the ship, who then told Felipe Pestaño about said drugs. The other Navy officer who mysteriously went missing was eventually reported as having gone overboard. Senator Lim was specifically talking about PO2 Fidel Tagaytay. It would seem that Tagaytay knew something about the gunmen who were responsible for Philip's alleged murder. Meanwhile, the radio operator was named PO2 Zosimo Villanueva. He was later found dead. The article that contained all this information about Senator Lim also contained a reference to a 48-page report that was penned by the late Senator and former Supreme Court Justice Marcelo Fernan, who also found that Philip did not kill himself. It would seem that Lim was either heavily leaning on that information found in this report, or the article simply wanted to mention that such a report existed and yet still ended up being rejected or not used to finally properly investigate Philip's death. Philip's story would slowly and eventually fade into obscurity after this, but not quite. When I researched this case, the earliest non-archived articles I could find go back to 2010, and that is where I will be picking up as a few bits and pieces of information were revealed, at least to me, that I have not encountered in the archived articles I had used so far. Earlier, I mentioned how former Ombudsman Merceditas Gutierrez dismissed a complaint filed by Philip's family in 2009. A few months later, in January 2010, the Pestaño family filed a motion for reconsideration, which was granted by Gutierrez's successor, Conchita Carpio Morales. This was momentous because this motion being granted in 2010 would set in motion another set of events that the Pestaño family hoped would finally move the needle on their son's case. At around the same time that this was happening with the Ombudsman's motion, Philip's case was brought by his parents to the United Nations, alleging that the Philippines was in breach of its obligations as a signatory of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the UN agreed. In March 2010, the UN Commission on Human Rights wrote the Philippine government saying, quote, "Despite allegations by the AFP, PNP, and DOJ, Pestaño was not a suicide, but the victim of homicide. The violation of Ensign Pestaño's right to life and to redress of grievance is directly attributable to the state and party, the Republic of the Philippines." End of quote. The Commission strongly urged the Philippine government to undertake enforceable remedies to finally prosecute someone for this crime 15 years after Philip's death. This was a huge blunder for the Philippine government, who at that point did not even know yet about how tough that year was going to be for its reputation alone. May I remind everyone of the Quirino Grandstand hostage-taking case, and then Macapagal Arroyo being the sitting president before Noynoy taking over by June, and then the Dacer Corbito case gaining traction again with Panfilo Lacson leaving the Philippines before charges could be filed against him for being the alleged mastermind in the men's killing. Don't worry, I'll be covering that case too in the near future. It may have been this calling out by the United Nations and the Ombudsman's willingness to finally listen to the Pestaño family that led to some more tangible results right at the beginning of 2012. It may have taken another 2 years, but at least there was movement at last. National and international news outlets in January 2012 reported that the Office of the Ombudsman intended to finally hold 10 Navy officers accountable for Philip's death, almost 17 years after his lifeless body was found on the BRP Bacolod in September 1995. With this action, Ombudsman Conchita Carpio Morales overturned the June 15, 2009 joint resolution that dismissed the criminal and administrative charges filed by the Pestaños and brought her case in front of the Sandigan Bayan. Carpio Morales found probable cause to indict the following Navy officers for Philip's murder: Captain Ricardo Ordonez, Commander Reynaldo Lopez, HM2 Wilmenio Aquino, Lieutenant Commander Luis de Garcasis, Lieutenant Commander Alfredric Alba, MR2 Sandy Miranda, Lieutenant Commander Joselito Colico, Lieutenant Commander Ruben Roque, Petty Officer First Class Carlito Amoroso, and Petty Officer Second Class Mil Leonor Igcasan. Parallel to the murder charges, Carpio also found the 10 officers administratively liable for grave misconduct and ordered them dismissed from service, at least those who were not retired yet. Carpio Morales emphasized that her office had strong reason to believe that the officers had conspired to murder Philip Pestaño. This move by the Ombudsman Office gave hope to Philip's family, who just wanted to be heard. They wanted everyone to know that their son did not die by suicide, but was murdered in cold blood. The Ombudsman's Office position can be outlined as follows, and please pay attention because there's new information included in here that I could not find in the archived articles I used, but they were thankfully covered and summarized by the reports written when Carpio Morales filed the charges against the 10 officers. So, firstly and obviously, Philip's injuries did not seem self-inflicted according to Carpio Morales. He had 2 bruises on his right temple and a cut on his left ear, which couldn't have been caused by the bullet, but rather by a blunt object. The bullet's entry wound was oval and lacked signs of close-range firing like tattooing or burning. Carpio Morales argued, quote, "It is far-fetched for a person who commits suicide to shoot himself in the head from a distance," end of quote. Furthermore, the Ombudsman highlighted forensic findings indicating that the handwriting on the suicide note differed from Pestaño's own handwriting. Essentially, Carpio Morales disputed the suicide theory because there was just too much conflicting evidence. For example, a medical examination of Philip's body indicated, as I mentioned before, a downward trajectory of the bullet, whilst the Philippine National Police Crime Laboratory claimed the bullet mark suggested an upward direction. Additionally, the bullet that supposedly killed Philip was found on the bed instead of the floor, contrary to expectations of those who were examining the crime scene. There was also blood smear on the cabin wall, but weirdly enough, no spatters, no bone fragments, or tissue nearby. And that is expected if the gunshot wound is to the head. Now, blood splotches were found on the pillow beside Pestaño's head, along with pools of blood on the bed. It was deemed implausible that blood could move from the bed to the pillow on its own. Morales also found it incredulous that Pestaño, who possessed his own gun, would borrow one from fellow officers Wilmenio Aquino to commit suicide, deeming it irrational for a military officer to even do so. In Morales' mind, there were too many things that didn't add up. Another thing about fellow officer Wilmenio Aquino. He was sort of put forward as a witness to the suicide. because, as I understand it, he was in the gangway near Philip's cabin immediately after shots rang out after Philip had allegedly killed himself. Now, according to Morales, that is impossible because around that time of Philip's supposed suicide, Aquino had just started his duty at his post. So how could he be at two places at the same time? Now, regarding the culpability of the 10 Navy officers in Pestaño's death, Morales stated that their fear of Pestaño exposing illegal activities aboard the BRP Bacolod appeared to be the motive of his murder. That is a no-brainer. She pointed out that both the Senate and the armed forces had received information about an undocumented lumber shipment aboard the ship, exchanged for drums of fuel oil. Pestaño, as a cargo deck officer, had reportedly objected to the shipment but was coerced by his superiors to allow it. Carpio Morales also highlighted the officers' supposed unnatural reactions upon discovering Pestaño's body. Morales noted that Captain Ordóñez, instead of immediately attending to Philip, focused on docking the ship at Navy headquarters, neglecting to preserve evidence in the cabin. Commander Lopez, purportedly Pestaño's closest friend, delayed visiting the cabin until the ship was docked and police arrived, which Morales deemed abnormal for someone grieving a friend's death. Lieutenant Commander Colico, upon finding the body, failed to promptly report it or check for signs of life, contrary to typical officer behavior in such situations. Lieutenant Commander Cassis did not intervene as Colico tampered with the gun, removing bullets and cleaning it, actions inconsistent with standard crime investigation procedures, especially for a U.S. Naval Academy graduate like Cassis. Morales concluded that these individual responses contradicted human nature and job experience, leading her to believe that the officers conspired to murder Philip and stage a suicide. Carpio Morales also highlighted the conflicting statements provided by the officers. Initially, Lieutenant Commander Colico informed the NBI that Lieutenant Commander Roque instructed him to check on Philip. However, he later told the police that he independently decided to do so, also providing inconsistent times regarding when he discovered the body. Colico claimed to have cleaned the gun and removed the bullets while accompanied by Lieutenant Commander Cassis and Officer Aquino. However, Lieutenant Commander Alba stated that he, Officer Miranda, and Aquino were present. Roque asserted his presence at the scene, but Cassis contradicted the statement. Captain Ordóñez omitted mentioning PO1 Amoroso's presence on the ship when Pestaño died. Subsequently, Ordóñez claimed that Amoroso disembarked at Sangli Point in Cavite and never returned. However, Amoroso's cabin mate stated that he remained on board, for sure, during the trip to Manila, where the Navy headquarters is situated. Now, if you did not understand what just happened there, what Morales was trying to point out with all these names and all these contradicting actions, that is okay, because that is exactly the point Morales was trying to make. There were just way too many statements that were contradictory, and nobody bothered to investigate these contradictions. Lastly, Carpio Morales considered new evidence from Pestaño's parents obtained from the Armed Forces investigation a decade after their son's death. One significant piece of evidence was the ship's deviation from its usual route, taking 2 hours instead of the typical 45 minutes from Sangli to Navy headquarters. I have mentioned this earlier already. The unexplained delay of around 1 hour and 15 minutes led to the presumption that this extra time was used by the respondents, by the defendants, to stage the suicide scenario. Moreover, pages were torn from the gangway logbook, which would have listed the crew members present on the ship. Additionally, there was no passenger manifest indicating who was on board, crucial for determining who should undergo a paraffin test to detect gunshot residue. These actions suggested a concerted effort to conceal vital information and evidence, according to Morales. Around at the same time of Carpio Morales' crusade to essentially fight for Philip's case, retired Captain Ricardo Ordonez, who was one of the 10 charged Navy officers in Philip's case, commented on the Ombudsman Office's renewed interest in the case, seeing as 3 investigative agencies had already cleared him in the past. From my research, it would seem that Ordonez was the most vocal of all the suspects. In 2005, for example, he sought to dispute the insinuations that he and the others conspired to kill Philip, still holding on to the suicide story and denying any of the other parts of the story now considered as fact by Ombudsman Morales. These parts being that there was illegal lumber shipments and drug pushing involved in the greater conspiracy to silence anyone who questioned the suicide story about Philip. Now, even though it looked like there was a lot of momentum at the beginning of 2012 and finally there was something positive in Philip's case, it would seem from the sources that I have found that not much was really going on in his case in that year. The systems had failed the Pestaño family yet again. The Commission on Human Rights never conducted an investigation in the end. There had not been any Senate resolution on the case, and the media had all but given up on further looking into this. The only positive thing that remained in this case was the fact that after the Navy questioned the Ombudsman's decision to recommend the dismissal of the 10 officers plus a filing of murder charge against all of them, it would seem that even the Court of Appeals was on the Ombudsman's side. You see, the Navy was not happy about the Ombudsman's decision, and so they brought a case in front of the Court of Appeals. The court had limited jurisdiction and could only rule in the matter of the dismissal, and in that case, they agreed with the Ombudsman. It could not rule on the legitimacy of the murder charge recommendations because there was a motion of reconsideration that was pending within the Ombudsman office about this very matter, so the court was very limited. So because all of this, Philip's family remained hopeful even a year later in October 2013 when the case was moving truly at a glacial pace. The Pestaño family even hoped that the case could be brought in front of the Supreme Court to really mobilize the authorities to pay attention to the now 18-year-old case at that point. Since it had been such a long time already, only 2 of the 10 accused officers were still in active duty. Now, remember in that year, Noynoy was president, and in that same year, former Ombudsman Gutierrez was being impeached. Her actions or lack thereof in Philip's case were one of the grounds for her impeachment. With the impeachment proceedings going on, the media also had a renewed interest in Philip's case, which in any case that had gone cold could only mean help and more exposure. Now, with the media's renewed interest, we were able to learn that one of the key officers in the case, Ruben Roque, had already left the country. Roque was the executive officer, the second in command back in September 1995. We would also learn that the Sandigan Bayan, upon receiving Ombudsman Morales' case, dismissed her case for a lack of jurisdiction, as this particular court only hears cases with the rank of colonel and higher. I don't know why that is, but that's the case. After this, the case was moved to the Manila Regional Trial Court, where things were a bit stop and start when an arraignment was postponed first thing and a new hearing was not scheduled until late 2013. A year later, in October 2014, things were yet again moving forward, but very, very slowly. 8 Navy officers were finally arraigned and all pleaded not guilty to the murder charges filed by Philip's family at the Manila Regional Trial Court. Only 8 pleaded because 2 former officers were at that point on the run. These were the aforementioned Ruben Roque and Carlito Amoroso. Roque was in the US, but Amoroso, according to contemporary reports, was in hiding, but could somehow still instruct his lawyers, who, together with the other lawyers of the other officers, petitioned for bail. 3 separate bail hearings were scheduled in late 2014. We now need to do a bit of a time jump of 2 years because, again, online reports, both archived and not, were very difficult to find in this case. So the next online report I could find was from October 2016. It would seem that 2 years after the last movement in this case, we find ourselves in the Court of Appeals. So in order to understand what had happened, I needed to find some other details to fill in the gap, and this is what I found. When the murder case was put to the Manila Regional Trial Court in 2014, it is my understanding that the question for the trial judge was whether there was probable cause to indict the Navy 8, a nickname I've decided to give the 8 arraigned Navy officers. Now, this was not a trial to determine guilt per se. The trial judge simply had to decide whether, yes, there was probable cause to indict, or no, there wasn't. In this case, he said yes. Naturally, this was a decision that the Navy 8 did not agree with. This decision was then appealed on grounds of grave abuse of discretion that, according to the officers, the trial judge showed, which then brings us back to the Court of Appeals. When the Court of Appeals allowed the case to be heard, the petitioners did not include all of the Navy 8 or all of the Navy 10, if you include the ones who were on the run. It excluded Lieutenant Commander Ruben Roque and Petty Officer Igkasan for some reason that I could not find. The Court of Appeals then decided a few months later in October 2016 that the trial judge, Josefina Sescar, did not abuse her judicial discretion. Now, when I first read this, I knew that the Navy 8 could go two ways: appeal this further up in the Supreme Court, or take this loss and prepare for an eventual trial at the Manila Regional Trial Court. Having scoured the internet for what happened afterwards, I found out that a year later in August 2017, no trial whatsoever had taken place just yet. But there was a bail hearing, after which the Navy 8 were granted temporary freedom. The court fixed the bail amount for the 8 accused former and current officers at 200,000 pesos each. Now, this decision on bail did not sit right with me. We are talking about a conspiracy to murder and then silence everyone who screamed it was murder for the past 2 decades at that point. But here's what the judge said, and perhaps the reason why he allowed bail. Quote, "While there is strong indication that Philip did not commit suicide and that someone killed him in view of the fact that apparently the suicide note was not written by one and the same person, the gunshot was allegedly fired at a distance of more than 3 feet, hence a physical impossibility of suicide, the presence of lacerated wound, an injury allegedly totally unrelated to the shooting as it was not in the trajectory of the bullet that entered the right temple and exited on the left temple of Philip's head, the court is not prepared to conclude that the evidence strongly suggests that all the accused in this case are the perpetrators thereof." End of quote. Here are 2 additional quotes from a report that covered the court proceedings that could not have been easy to hear for the Pestaño family. Quote, "The court added mere inconsistencies on the testimonies of the 8 accused during the investigation on the incident will not strongly suggest the conclusion that they were in unison to perpetrate the crime. More so, the suspicion that all the accused were involved in the grand cover-up of Philip's murder will not suffice to seal the prosecution's position." End of quote. In the bail proceedings, Ruben Roque and Carlito Amoroso were excluded, who were still at large at that point, as I already mentioned. Now, back in August 2017, the trial judge ruled that the trial should start on November 9th, 2017, a whole 22 years after Philip's death. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for some time now, you know that this is hardly surprising. The wheels of justice in the Philippines grind to an almost halt for cases like Philip's. And if it were not for family members who were constantly keeping the case in the media or fighting for it in all courts with adequate funding to boot, cases like this just die off and get buried in a prosecutor's office. November 2020, the world was in the tight grip of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Philippines was witnessing countless deaths due to the deadly virus. It was due to all the coronavirus news that the public almost missed a court decision that was 25 years in the making. In an order made on the 27th of November 2020, Judge Hannah Ariola of the Manila Regional Trial Court dismissed all charges against all the Navy officers in the Pestaño case. Here are two quotes that were reported widely when the decision came out. Quote, "Endless possibilities on what may have happened on board Philippine Navy ship BRP Bacolod on that fateful day, which sanctioned reasonable doubt on accused guilt. It is elementary that when the court finds the evidence insufficient to support a verdict of guilt, the court shall grant a demurrer and the criminal case be dismissed." End of quote. Just to clarify what a demurrer is, it is a legal instrument, an objection granting the factual basis of an opponent's point by dismissing it as irrelevant or invalid. With this decision, even the media succumbed to the narrative spread by the Navy 10 and the Navy itself that Philip killed himself, and that the suspicions he had about the lumber or the drugs were all baseless. It must have been hard for his family to see all their work, emotional, physical, or otherwise, go to nothing after a legal fight that lasted quite literally a quarter of a century. Now, remember that when Carpio Morales restarted the engines of this case, she also filed an administrative case against all the officers for grave or gross misconduct. This was a case that also made its way through the courts in a parallel manner, and by 2021, it reached the Supreme Court, who decided to clear all the officers of any gross misconduct charges by Carpio Morales. The Supreme Court stated that when the Navy officers were first administratively charged in 2009, and when these charges were dismissed, that decision was supposed to be final and executory. The court said that by recharging the officers, Carpio Morales was in violation of her own office's internal rules of procedure. The Supreme Court added that the finding of gross misconduct by the Ombudsman did not sufficiently state the facts and the law it was based on. The court also stated that the finding of gross misconduct seemed to hinge entirely on the existence of a conspiracy to commit murder, meaning that the finding that should have been based on administrative liability was instead based on criminal liability, which is just not how things work, if I'm going to put it in layman's terms. I could go on and on about this and really let loose my legal geek, but let's not do that in this episode. Now, the Supreme Court made it also clear that the Ombudsman's decision on the criminal aspect, so the murder, was only probable cause to file a charge in court and not a conviction. It stated, quote, "Even assuming that the records indicate the existence of a felonious scheme, the administrative liability of a person allegedly involved in such a scheme cannot be established through conspiracy, considering that one's administrative liability is separate and distinct from penal liability." End of quote. And that is where essentially the trail of reports on Philip's case ends. I am aware that there was a change.org petition going on at some point, but this is now closed. All in all, this is tragic, sad, and frustrating. I would have wanted to know more about what actually happened during the trial, what evidence was brought forward, and whether Philip's family felt like the public, media, and court were hell-bent on finding in favor of the Navy 10. That last part was not implausible, since the Pestaño family were up against a whole government entity, the Navy and the government itself. I feel sorry for Philip's parents, who fought so hard for so long, only to be dismissed on all fronts. It seems too much of a punishment on top of already the biggest punishment of them all, losing their son. And I can only hope that both of them, both Felipe and Evelyn, have found peace and closure this last 3 years. LagimFam, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for all the support and your patience. It has been an odd few months for me personally, but I am thankful you have not given up on me. Tomorrow, Season 5, Episode 1 will be dropping, so watch out for that. Isang pakiusap lang po. Please share my social media posts about my episodes and the podcast in general. And please share it far and wide. Share my episodes, share my profile, share my tweets, whatever. I have lost a lot of listeners and followers due to my stance on Palestine. I do not regret this one bit, but I am hoping to reach new listeners who are true crime fans, but who are also open about what I have to say about Palestine and other political happenings in the world right now. So thank you so much for your support and help. Anyway, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you did, make sure to also rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it helps with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. And trust me, a lot of people do not know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you so much, LagimFam. Daghang salamat and mabuhay.